of diagrams that we use to is the kind of stuff that we will be going over in class for today. Let me pull up our classroom here. Okay, here we go. All right, so today is going to be all about these diagrams called pedigrees, which are ways that we show how certain traits have been passed down from generation to generation. So remember, we've been spending almost all term talking about DNA and chromosomes and how they're related and how they get passed down. So in a full set of human genes, which a picture of that is called a karyotype, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? We have our 22 kind of normal somatic autosomal chromosomes, and then that one pair of sex chromosomes, where if you get XX, you're a female, and if you get XY, you're a male. So 46 chromosomes in total in humans. 23 pairs gives us a total number of 46 in those normal diploid cells. So autosomes, like I mentioned, that is the name given to these first 22 pairs of human chromosomes. So again, they do not influence the sex of the individual. They can influence hair color, eye color, skin color, height, whether or not you have freckles, whether or not you have a widow's peak for your hairline, all sorts of stuff like that can be determined by the autosomes. But the major thing that is not is the sex of the person. That is determined by this 23rd pair of chromosomes, also called the sex chromosomes. So the reason why I bring this up now is that a little bit later on, we're going to talk about certain traits, certain diseases that are linked to the sex chromosomes that you can get on your X or your Y chromosome. So even though these are different from the other chromosomes, they still have genes on them. They still carry certain information in order to produce a fully developed, fully formed human being. So if you ever hear autosome or autosomal gene, autosomal chromosome, that just refers to the 22 kind of normal basic chromosomes. And then a sex chromosome or a sex-linked gene is one that's on your X or Y chromosome. So a pedigree is this type of chart that you can see right here that shows the relationship between parents and grandparents and children and how a certain trait is passed down from one generation to the next. So we'll talk more specifically about what all the different types of boxes mean. But in general, each generation goes on a line. So you have your grandparents up here. You have their children and the people that their children married on the second line. And then you have their grandchildren down here on the third row. So each one of these boxes, this square or this circle, represents a person in this family. Either they were born into this family or they got married into this family. But that is what a pedigree shows us. It's kind of like a family tree where specific information is shown about certain traits, certain phenotypes that we can see in this family. So the whole tree, the whole chart all together is called a pedigree. So there are kind of usually basic rules that go into making a pedigree. So again, it's this visual showing the kind of inheritance pattern of a specific trait. And in general, on a pedigree, males are represented by a square. Females are represented by a circle. And then you can have one of three situations in terms of the specific trait that we're looking at. Because again, a pedigree isn't just a family tree. It doesn't just show who all is related in this family. It specifically shows how a specific trait is passed down from one generation to the other. So in general, people who have that trait are represented by a filled in box, either a filled square or circle. So in this case, it's filled with purple. People who are not affected, who do not have the trait, have an open or an empty box, an empty square or circle. And then later we'll talk about people who are carriers, which are people who do not show the trait, but still have it in their genes. And we'll talk about those type of people next. So males and females are squares and circles. And then if that box is filled in, like it is with all these people down here, that means that they all have the trait that we're interested in. So like yesterday, we were talking about freckles and how freckles are passed between the different Weasley people in the Harry Potter universe. So this pedigree would tell us that everybody in this family has freckles. The way we show how people are related to each other are these lines that connect the boxes. So parents, or people who are married, or people who are parents, are usually represented by having a line connect them. And then a vertical line connects them to their offspring. So you have the parents up here on the one level, and then below them, directly connected to them, are their kids, are their offspring. So in this family, in this family, for example, we have a mom and a dad who have this trait, say who have freckles. And these parents have 2 daughters and 1 son, and all of them have freckles. Right? All of these are filled in boxes, so they all have the trait that we are looking at in this pedigree. So that's sort of the basic rules of a pedigree. If they're connected with a horizontal line, it means that they are parents, and that they're married, or at least that they're together, or they were at some point. And then the vertical lines represents their children. So like, for example, in this one that we were just looking at, we have the original parents who would become the grandparents in this first one. And then these grandparents had 1, 2, 3, 4 children, right? These parents ended up having, let's see here, 1, 2, 3 boys and 1 girl. So they have 4 children, but there's 8 people represented on this second line. And that's because these 4 children married and had children of their own, right? So this would be their son, but then this is their daughter-in-law, right? This is the woman who is not directly related to them, but married and had children with their son. Same thing with their son-in-law over here is married to their daughter. And then we have 2 more daughter-in-laws that are married to their sons. So again, they are only related to the original parents if they're connected with one of these vertical lines right here. Otherwise, it just means that if they're like this, it means that they married in to this side of the family. So again, horizontal line indicates marriage and having children. Vertical lines connects them to the children that they had. And then if they're blank, like these ones, they do not show the trait. If they are filled in, like these ones, they do show the trait. And then in some pedigrees, they'll be half filled in, meaning that it's a carrier of the trait but does not show the trait. So in this case, it would be if we're dealing with a recessive trait like no freckles, right? We said on Tuesday that no freckles, the little f, is our recessive trait. So not all pedigrees show carriers, but the ones they do, the carriers would be people who would be big F, little f. They're big F, which means they have the freckle trait and they're showing it, but they have a little f, which means they could potentially have children that do not have freckles. Same thing with brown hair, red hair from the other day, right? Red hair, we said, was recessive, little r, little r. So if somebody had brown hair and they had big R, little r, they would also be a carrier. They are brown hair. They have brown hair that we can see, but they also carry the red hair trait. They could potentially have children that have red hair. So a little bit later on, we'll show examples of why knowing about carriers could be important. All right, is everybody okay with pedigrees so far? Anything about the different symbols or anything that I've shown you guys that's still a little bit?
No.
All right. So that's sort of the basic way how you set up a pedigree. You link the people who are married with children with these horizontal lines, and then you link the children to the parents with these vertical lines, and then you fill in the boxes of the people who have the trait you're interested in. The other important way to read a pedigree is that usually there are a lot of times we want to point out specific people on the pedigree, and you want to tell everyone else exactly what person that you're looking at. So if I was just talking to you and I wanted to talk about this person, if we didn't have these little numbers and these numbers, then I'd have to kind of confusingly explain, oh, the son of the original, the great grandparent couple who had this son, the one over on the far right there with the square. And that's kind of hard to get across. So instead, a way that scientists have come up with to read these and make it a little bit more clear who you're talking about is that the generations are indicated with these Roman numerals. So we have I, and IV, meaning generations 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then specific people in a generation are labeled with the normal Arabic numbers. So, and we start over for each generation. So in generation 1, we have person 1 and person 2. In generation 2, we have persons 1, 2, 3, 4. And then generation 3, we have people 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then same with generation 4. So the way that people came up with to figure out exactly who you're talking about is that they'll do the generation number dash the individual number. So like I-2 or I-4 or 3-5. So that when you write it out and say you're like emailing back and forth or you're writing back and forth with your colleagues and you want to know exactly who they're talking about, it's easy to pick out these people on the pedigree. And so I'm going to have you guys help me with these 4 examples right here. Feel free to answer either out loud or in the chat. And knowing what we have just learned about the pedigree, I want you to tell me, are the following individuals male or female? So first up, we have 1-2. Is 1-2 a male or female?
Male?
Male, exactly. So we go 1, generation 1, person 2 is right here. They are represented by a square, so they are a male. Remember, squares are males, circles are female. So what about person 2-4? Is 2-4 a male or a female?
Female?
Female, exactly. Generation 2 is right here, person 4. So this is 2-4 right here. This person is a circle, which means they are female. What about 3-5? Is 3-5 a male or a female?
Female.
Female, exactly. Generation 3, person 5 is a circle, which means female. And then finally, either Naya or Samyan, I want you guys to answer this, one of you guys to answer this time. Person 4-1. Is person 4-1 a male or a female?
Male.
Male, exactly. It's this guy right here, 4-1. And 4-1 is a square, which means that he is a male. So that is how you pick out individual people quickly on a pedigree. You have it all nicely labeled like this, and then you're able to quickly say, okay, 2-4, 2 is over here, 4 is over here, bingo. 4-1, go down to 4, go over to 1, here we go. All right, very, very nice, good job. So there are a couple of different kind of major types of pedigrees that are out there. And they usually show 2 different things. There's pedigrees for autosomal traits, so those normal standard chromosomes, and pedigrees that deal with sex-linked traits that are on the X and Y chromosome. They're also combined with either dominant pedigrees, showing how a dominant trait gets passed down through the generations, and recessive pedigrees, which is the same thing for recessive traits. So an autosomal dominant pedigree just means that we're showing how a dominant trait, like freckles from or brown hair from the other day, both of those were dominant traits. And so this pedigree shows us how that dominant trait on a non-sex chromosome, an autosome, gets passed down through the generations. So remember, if it's a dominant trait, then that means that anybody that gets one of those dominant genes, one of those dominant alleles, is going to have the trait. So the mom and dad both have the trait, and we have the additional information that they are both big A, little a. So they're both heterozygous. They have one big and one little letter, one dominant and one recessive. So they both have the trait, so they get their boxes filled in. And then if you look down at their kids, 3 of their kids have the trait and 1 does not. So 3 of the kids have at least one big A in their genotype. We have 2 big A, little a's, just like the parents, and 1 big A, big A. So just like mom and dad, all 3 of these people show the trait. So if this was brown hair versus red hair, for example, the mom and dad would be brown haired. This son and these 2 daughters would also be brown haired because they have that brown hair trait. But this son would be red haired. So this son does not get a box filled in. He gets an empty box because he does not have the trait. So affected people, the people with the trait, with the brown hair, get the filled in boxes. recessive trait who does not have it, who has the red hair, does not get filled in. So because it is a dominant trait on a autosomal dominant pedigree, usually you see half or more than half of the people get the trait because there's only one allele that's needed for it to show up. So it's usually a pretty common trait. So most of the people on a dominant pedigree will have the trait, and occasionally there'll be some people that do not have the trait. So this is one type of pedigree, autosomal dominant. Again, a dominant trait that's not on a sex chromosome, that's on one of those normal 22 chromosomes. We can also have the flip side of that, an autosomal recessive pedigree. So this shows how a recessive trait can get passed down through generations. So now we're not interested in the brown-haired people anymore. We want to know about the red-haired people. How likely is it that you're going to get red hair in this family? So recessive pedigrees are the only ones that have the carriers. You may have noticed in the dominant pedigree, there's no carrier boxes because in dominance, you either have it or you don't. Because the trait is dominant, if it's there, it'll show up, and if it's not there, then it won't. Recessives are a little bit different. People with the recessive gene could still pass that recessive trait on to their offspring, to their kids, even if they do not have the trait themselves. So if we are sticking with our brown hair, red haired example, now this is a recessive pedigree, so we want to know about who has the red hair trait. Who out of their kids is going to be red hair? So people who are homozygous dominant, meaning they have the two big letters and are dominant, they don't have any red-haired gene in them at all, right? They have two brown-haired genes. People that are heterozygous have the mixture of the big and little. They are still unaffected. They have brown hair, not red hair, but they are carriers because they have that red-haired gene. And so they could potentially, based on their partner, pass that red-haired trait down to their offspring. So in this case, we're looking at the same pedigree as before, but flipped to show the recessive side. So both of these parents are carriers, right? They both have that little a, that red hair trait, that red hair allele, but they're still both brown-haired. So these are two brown hair parents who are carriers of the red hair allele. So one of their daughters totally does not get any red hair trait at all. She gets the two brown hair. One daughter and one son have brown hair, but they are carriers. They still carry the trait of red hair. And one son will have red hair. One son, even though both parents are brown-haired, one son still ends up with red hair. So on a recessive pedigree, because it is recessive, you tend to see it happening rarely. So maybe only a couple people in the pedigree will have the trait. And you can also see people who are carriers. So if there are carriers in your pedigree, then it has to be a recessive pedigree. Dominant pedigrees do not have carriers, only these recessive ones. So like I said, these are on our autosomal chromosomes, the ones that are the normal original pair of 22 that get passed out and sorted exactly like all the other chromosomes. So these are like the autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant. That's like the basic stuff that we were talking about on Tuesday when we were going through the different families and the different traits and how calculating the percentages. That was all based on this idea of a normal autosomal gene. All right, so before I move on, we start talking about sex-linked genes. Does anybody have any questions or concerns now? Anything about the dominant versus the recessive pedigree that you're still a little confused about? Anything with these carriers that's still not very clear? Any questions up to?
No.
All right, Naya is good. Anybody else? Anything that you want me to go back and talk about? All right, doesn't sound like it, so we will keep moving right along. So up next, we are dealing with sex-linked traits. Sex-linked traits are a little bit different from the autosomal traits because, again, autosomal traits, you always have 2 copies of each gene. You always have 2 alleles for each gene, whether that's 2 big A's or a big A little a or a little a. That'll always be the case. Sex-linked traits are a little bit different, though. They still have dominant and recessive alleles, so that's still true. But the genes for sex-linked traits are only on the X chromosome. So I don't know if you guys noticed it when we were looking at the karyotype earlier. But the Y chromosome is very, very small compared to the X chromosome, very itty bitty. The Y chromosome has almost no genes on it. So all of the sex-linked genes that scientists study and are interested in, they are all located on the X chromosome. So that means if you are born as a female, you're going to have X and X, which means they're still going to have the same double copies, just like all these other guys. But if you are born as a male and you get the X and Y, you're only going to have 1 copy of that allele. You're only going to have a big A or 1 little a because you don't have any alleles on the Y chromosome over here. So scientists came up with a little bit different way to label the alleles on sex-linked chromosomes. Instead of just using the big A, little a, instead they use X's and Y's and then write in the allele next to the X to show that the allele is only on the X chromosome. So, for example, the genotypes of people who have a sex-linked dominant trait. So dominance works just like it does with the other chromosomes, where if you have the dominant allele, it'll show up no matter what. And the recessive allele only shows up if there's no dominant allele present. So for females, it works basically the exact same way as it does in the other types of genes. So in females, you'll get the dominant trait if you have a big A, or if you have a big A, little a. Just like all the other ones, as long as there's 1 big A there, you're going to have the dominant trait. In males, you only need the 1 big A, because remember, the Y doesn't contribute anything in terms of the alleles. It's just there to show that this is a male. So a male that inherits the big A from their mom will have the trait. On the flip side, a male that inherits the recessive little a from their mom will not have the trait. So if we're looking at a dominant trait, even if you only get 1 copy of the recessive trait in a male, you're not going to end up showing that dominant trait. Whereas in females, you have to have the 2 recessive copies, the 2 little a's, in order for the dominant trait not to be there. So again, females work just like our normal genotypes that we were looking at earlier, but males only get 1 copy of the X chromosome. So they are either going to have the trait and have a dominant copy, or not have the trait and have a recessive copy. On the flip side, if we're dealing with a sex-linked recessive trait, so a trait that shows up if you have the recessive genotype, again, for females, they only get the trait if they get 2 copies of the recessive allele, 2 little a's. If they get a big A or a big A little a, then they will not have the trait, but they could become carriers if they have that mix. Whereas on the male side, it's basically 50-50. Because the Y chromosome doesn't matter for anything in terms of these traits, males that inherit a little a on their X chromosome from their moms will get the recessive trait, and males that inherit a big A from their moms will not inherit the recessive trait. So most of the sex-linked traits, most of the most famous ones that we're going to be talking about today, are different types of diseases, and they tend to be recessive. So they tend to be this recessive trait category, where women only get them, females only get them if they get the 2 recessive traits from their mom and dad, but males will get it if they just get that 1 recessive allele from their mom, but they won't get it if they get that 1 from their dad. So again, biggest difference with sex-linked traits, they're on those X chromosomes, and it mostly impacts the males. For females, because females have 2 copies of the X chromosome anyway, that means that they're going to have 2 copies of each trait, just like all the other normal chromosomes. But for males, since the Y doesn't contribute any alleles, they're only going to get 1 allele. If they inherit the dominant allele, they'll get the dominant trait. If they inherit the recessive allele, they'll get the recessive trait. No matter what they get from their dad, all that matters is what they get from their mom. Because again, Ys can only come in males. The Y chromosome comes from the dad, and the X chromosome comes from the mom. Whereas females inherit 1 X from their dad and 1 X from their mom. All right, so let's take a look at how this can affect some different traits. So on a sex-linked recessive pedigree, right, this is a pedigree where we're dealing with a recessive trait that could be showing up. And so we're going to draw a pedigree showing a cross between a normal male and a carrier female. So this pedigree, actually, now that I'm looking at it, it's kind of backwards. It's flipped around a little bit, where the filled in represents the dominant trait and the empty represents the recessive trait. So we have a dominant normal male and a carrier female. So she has 1 big, 1 little. So any son automatically gets the Y chromosome from their dad, right? And so they can't inherit this dominant allele. And so there's a 50-50 shot if they get the dominant allele from their mom or the recessive allele from their mom. All right, the mom has the dominant and the recessive. She's a carrier of the recessive trait. So she doesn't have it, but she could still pass it on to one of her kids. So even though the mom and dad both do not have the trait, because the mom has that recessive allele, one of their kids could still end up with the recessive trait. On the flip side, the X allele from the dad has to go to the daughters. So remember, it's all determined by the father what the sex of the child is going to be. If the dad passes on the X chromosome, it's going to be a female because they're also going to get the X from their mom. If the dad passes on the Y chromosome, it's going to be a male. So the daughters over here, neither of them have the trait, right? Because one of them got the 2 big dominant alleles, and the other one got the recessive from the mom, but still got the dominant from the dad. So she is a carrier, but she is not affected by the trait. So notice there's a difference between the sons and the daughters here, right? The sons, it was a 50-50 shot if they got the recessive trait or if they did not get the recessive trait, but neither of the daughters got the recessive trait. One of them, it got the fully dominant set of alleles, and one of them got the heterozygous mixed set of alleles. But neither of them got the full recessive trait. So that's one of the interesting things about sex-linked recessive genes and alleles, is that the trait, which is usually some type of disease or condition or illness, is much more likely to show up in the male children than it is in any of the female children. And again, that's because the males cannot get any sort of dominant gene from their dad. They just get the Y chromosome from their dad. So whether or not they get the trait depends on the alleles that they inherit from their mom. And again, since they only have the one allele that determines their trait, they either get it, they either get the recessive disease, or they don't. There's no carrier option for the male children in the case of these recessive sex-linked genes. All right, before we move on and talk about some kind of specific examples of these, does anybody have any questions, anything about these sex-linked traits that you're still a little bit confused about, a little bit not clear on?
Yes, Mr. Michael, this part is a little bit harder. I didn't really understand.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm glad that you brought it up. So here we'll go back a little bit. So you know how for most traits, like the ones that we were talking about yesterday, there were the 2 alleles. They could be big, they could be big, little, they could be big, little, or little. And depending on the combination of alleles that you got, that would determine what type of trait that you had. Either you got the big, and big, little, and you had the dominant trait, or you had the little, and you had the recessive trait, right? So like we had the hair color example yesterday, and if you got the big, I think it was R in our example, but let's say it's A today. So if you got the big A, or big A, little a, you had brown hair. But if you got little a, you had red hair. Sex-linked changes that up a little bit. For sex-linked traits, it's still the exact same rules for females. So we show it on like an X like this because it just means that it's specifically on the X chromosome. And women get 2 X chromosomes. So they still have 2 alleles for each trait. So you can still have big A, or big A, or little a. And the traits work out the same like they do in the other chromosomes. If you have a dominant, 2 dominant, or a dominant recessive genotype, then you have the dominant trait, you have brown hair. But if you get the recessive genotype, then you end up with the recessive trait, you end up with red hair. That part makes sense so far?
Yes, Mr. Michael.
Okay. The way that sex-linked traits are different is for the men, the male children, the boy children, they inherit the Y chromosome from their dad. And the Y chromosome does not have any genes on it. It doesn't have any of these traits on it. So the phenotype, the characteristic that the male children have is completely dependent on the X chromosome that they have. So instead of having 2 copies of each allele, on sex-linked traits, males only have 1 copy. They either get the dominant copy and they show the dominant trait, the brown hair, or they get the recessive copy and they show the recessive trait, the red hair. So the biggest difference, and the kind of the most important one to keep track of, is that male children only need 1 recessive copy in order to have the recessive trait, like red hair. Whereas before, on the normal chromosomes, and with females that have 2 X chromosomes, you need 2 copies of the recessive gene. In males, you only need 1 copy of the recessive gene. Because again, the Y doesn't count. So if you get the recessive trait, the little a, from your mom, you're going to have the recessive gene, the recessive trait characteristic. If you get the dominant trait from your mom, the big A, then you're going to have the dominant trait. So in this example right here, let's go back to that brown hair, red hair example. So we have a brown haired dad and a brown haired mom. And the mom is a heterozygote, meaning that she has one of her X's has the dominant copy and one of her X's has the recessive copy. For the female kids, it works the same way like it would normally. They inherit the X from their dad, which has the big copy, and they inherit an X from their mom, either the big or the little copy. And so the female children could end up with big R, and end up with the brown hair, or big R, little r, and still end up with the brown hair. So they're going to inherit this brown-haired allele from their dad and end up with brown hair. The sons, on the other hand, will always inherit the Y chromosome from their dad because that's what determines that they are sons. That's what determines that they're males. You have to be XY in order to be born as a male. So that means that they have a 50-50 shot of either getting the dominant brown hair gene from their mom or the recessive red hair gene from their mom. And again, since their Y chromosome is the one that they get from their father, and that does not affect anything in terms of the genes, their trait totally depends on the copy that they receive from the mom. If they get the X big R copy, the dominant copy, then they'll have brown hair. If they get the little r copy, then they'll have red hair. No in between, no having this mix, because they will always have a Y chromosome. And so it's their single X chromosome that determines whether or not they have the dominant trait versus the recessive trait. Does that help a little bit?
Yes.
All right, let me actually show you a kind of real life example that might actually help with this. So color blindness is something that a lot of people in the world actually deal with. For the most part, it's usually not like complete color blindness. So only an extremely tiny, small percentage of people have full color blindness where they see the world in black and white. Most people who have color blindness Usually it just means that they don't see all of the colors in the normal way. I think the most common type out there is called red-green color blindness, and it's where their brain kind of fuses red and green into the same type of shade. So they have a really hard, they can see like purple and blue and yellow really, really distinctly. But if you put a red and a green color next to each other for them, they have a hard time telling you which one is red and which one is green. And so here's kind of the whole spectrum from normal vision to completely black and white, but usually there's some sort of crossover with the red and the green. Either they can't see red, or they can't see green, or they can't see blue, or there's some sort of mix in between. So regardless, even though they're seeing some of the colors in this original clown image, they're not quite getting everything, right? If you've ever seen these tests before, these are used to help people identify issues with color blindness, because hopefully you can see, despite the fact that there are all these different colored bubbles, you can see in the middle of each of these, there's a number, right? There's a 7 right here. There's a 6 right here. There's a 26 right here. There's a 73. This one's a 21 or 71. This one's a 45. But people with certain types of color blindness can't pick out which dots are different colors from each other. All the dots kind of look the same to them, and so they can't read the number that is on there. One of the interesting things about color blindness is that it mainly affects boys. Most of the red-blue colorblind people in the world are men. And that's because color blindness is a sex-linked recessive gene. So that means that if you have a dad who is not colorblind and a mom who is not colorblind, but she has the colorblind allele. So in this case, the normal is the filled in blue square. The colorblind is the open square. So the affected genotypes are, in order for a female to be affected, she has to inherit the 2 recessive colorblind alleles. So little b means colorblind. Males, though, only have to inherit 1 colorblind allele. So this dad will pass on this dad does not have color blindness. He has the dominant no colorblind gene. So because both of his daughters will inherit his non-colorblind gene, both of them will have a dominant gene. They'll have at least one of those filled in X alleles. So neither of them will have color blindness. The sons, on the other hand, since they will always get the Y chromosome from their dad, they have a 50-50 shot at either inheriting the normal allele from their mom or the colorblind allele from their mom. So because the sons only have to inherit 1 copy of the colorblind allele, that means that it is easier for boys to be born as colorblind than it is for girls. Because again, if the dad is not colorblind, then it is impossible for either of his daughters to get colorblindness, because he'll always pass on his normal X allele. It's the sons who get the Y allele from their dad, so it's totally dependent on which allele that they inherit from their mom, whether they are colorblind or not. Does this make a little bit more sense, or kind of help you see a little bit more how the sex-linked alleles work?
Yes, Mr. Michael, thank you.
Oh, awesome. That's great. Another common sex-linked trait, sex-linked disorder is hemophilia, which is where people have limited amounts of blood clotting. So even a relatively minor scratch or injury to these people could become deadly, because even if it's just a little cut, it won't clot up and make a scab. It'll just keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. So it can lead to some pretty nasty internal bleeding contusions as well. And again, it tends to affect more male children than it does female, because again, it's a sex-linked recessive gene. So if neither of the parents have it, but the mom is a carrier, meaning that she has the normal gene, which is the black X in this case, and the hemophilia gene, which is the green X, the dad will always pass on his normal X gene to his daughters. So both of the girls here are going to get their dad's copy of the normal X gene. So depending on what they get from the mom, they could either be totally dominant or they could be a carrier, but it's impossible for either of them to be hemophiliac. The sons, on the other hand, since they get the Y copy from their dad, there's a 50% chance that their sons will have hemophilia, because there's a 50-50 shot that they get the normal X from their mom and don't have it, or that they get the hemophilia X from their mom and do have it. So again, even if neither parent has it, the girls, there's a 50% chance that one of them will be a carrier of the gene, but on the boys' side, there's a 50% chance that one of them will have the disorder, will have the disease. They'll inherit that recessive hemophilia gene from their mom. All right, so again, sex-linked recessive genes, and these ones, the ones that we've been talking about, tend to affect male children more than female, because they don't have any way to get that dominant healthy gene from their dad. They get the Y chromosome from their dad, which doesn't help them at all prevent them from being hemophiliac or non-hemophiliac, or having color blindness versus not having color blindness. It all depends on their mom, and if she's a carrier, then there's a 50-50 shot that they'll get it or they won't. All right, some other types of sex-linked genes. Albinism, so people who don't produce any melanin in their skin. So their skin, their hair, their eyebrows, it's all completely white or completely without any sort of pigment. Again, very similar thing, where they have to, I think actually albinism might be just a normal recessive gene. So in this case, boys or girls are equally likely to end up with the same outcome. Cystic fibrosis is a pretty nasty genetic disease that causes these like fibrous tendrils to develop in the lungs, this really thick, sticky mucus that makes it super hard to breathe. Again, it's just a normal recessive genotype. Sickle cell anemia is a really famous one, where the disease itself is pretty gnarly. It causes the red blood cells to form these kind of sickle shapes, which makes it really hard for them to pass through capillaries and act as normal blood cells. And again, we can track these things through pedigrees. So with these diagrams showing this family tree of inheritance and being able to point out specific people and pick out this person has this trait, this person does not, these parents passed on this specific trait to their offspring, so on and so forth. All right, so again, on most pedigrees, you have your different generations on the different lines. Squares are the male side, circles are the female side, and we can point to different people based on their number of generation and based on their number of people. So like this would be 1-2. This person would be 2-5. This person would be 3-2 or 4-9. So you can point out and quickly find individual people on this pedigree. So the reason why whenever you go to the doctor, one of the things that they always ask you is about your family history of cancer or Alzheimer's or diabetes or things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, albinism, color blindness, because all of that stuff is diseases that can be inherited and passed down from parents to offspring. They're diseases that happen at the level of the DNA and the gene. So if you do have a family history, doctors can create a pedigree similar to this one for you and your family and try to figure out how likely is it that either you have inherited a specific type of disease from your parents, or how likely is it that you'll pass on a type of genetic disease to your kids, should you ever choose to have some someday. And so we don't just create these pedigrees because we like tracing this family history stuff. They're really, really important in a medical sense to try and figure out where have these different diseases moved throughout your family history, and how likely is it that either you have a disease or you're the carrier of a disease that could be passed on to the next generation. All right, any final questions about pedigrees, alleles, sex-linked genes, autosomal traits, anything that I've talked about so far this evening?
I have a question, Mr. Michael. Those
Yeah.
can we stop them to not go to the other generations, or no?
So a lot of times, no, unfortunately. There's some of those diseases where we're able to treat them after they show up. Like there's been a lot of work I know on cystic fibrosis. But since they're encoded in people's DNA, it's very, very difficult to actually treat the disease because it's something that's happening essentially naturally within your body, right? It's reading your DNA, it's reading those genes, it's making those proteins. It's just so happened that the way it's making them is actually not helpful to your system. So there are a lot of researches going on right now to look at going in and actually editing the DNA of people in order to take out some of those genes that are causing these diseases. You may have heard of it in the news over the last 5 or so years. There's a new technology called CRISPR-Cas9, which allows scientists to pinpoint a specific area of DNA, go in, cut it out, and replace it with something else. It's been really limited in terms of its trials on humans because there's still a lot of stuff that we're working on with it. But that is one hope for eventually cutting down on these types of genetic diseases. So for the most part, a lot of times, if people have them, there's really not much you can do about it. Like Parkinson's is a really famous one, the one that causes people to like kind of lose control of their ability to sit still. They constantly like are shaking a little bit. Michael J. Fox from the Back to the Future movies and other TV shows and stuff famously has Parkinson's and has been dealing with that for the last couple decades. Huntington's is another really rough disease that tends to cause people to develop neurological problems in like their 30s and 40s and causes them to deteriorate pretty quickly. And there aren't really any cures for those type of diseases right now, because it's not like a bacteria that you can take an antibiotic for. It's not like COVID or another virus that you can make a vaccine for. This is something that your body is doing to itself. It's reading the genes in your DNA just like it would with anything else. It just so happens that those genes are causing you to have these issues. So unfortunately, right now, we don't really have any way of curing it or preventing it. Some of them, the symptoms can be managed a lot better than they could in the past. But there is a lot of research looking into how can we change people's genes and change their DNA in order to take out the genes that are causing them to have these different diseases. All right, great question. Right, so for the homework for today, let me jump back to that really quick. I'm basically giving you a couple different pedigrees. Oh, actually, I don't know why I left that screen. That's the one I needed to go to anyways. I'm gonna show you guys a couple different pedigrees and have you guys answer some questions about what they are showing. Let's see here. There we go. So if we go and look at the homework for today, I think there are 2 or 3 pedigrees. I think there's 2. Yeah. So we have 2 different pedigrees showing some different types of traits. So in this first one, we have a pedigree for a family that's dealing with Huntington's disease, the one I was talking about earlier that causes the neurological issues. And so we have 3 generations and then 5 or 6 questions. Yeah, 6 questions about some stuff just about general, your ability to read a pedigree. So like, can you tell me which people in here are afflicted with Huntington's? Do you think it's dominant or recessive? And then some basic questions like person 1 and person 2, 1-1 and 1-2. How many children did they have? How many girls came from 2-1 and 2-2? And how many of them have Huntington's? How are 2-2 and 2-4 related? Or how are 1-2 and 3-5 related? So kind of testing you on your ability to read the pedigree and figure out what are these people's relationships with each other. And then very similar type of questions for the second one down here. This one isn't hitchhiker's thumb, which is like the fact that sometimes some people, when they point their thumb out, the tip of it goes like way backwards. So again, on this one, the filled in boxes, the filled in square and circle right here, represent people who do have hitchhiker's thumb. Empty boxes mean that you do not. And so this one's asking, do you think it's a dominant or recessive trait? And then how do you know? And then again, how are individuals 3-2 and 3-3 related? Which people here have the hitchhiker's thumb? Who are the 2 people that are the most likely carriers of the hitchhiker's thumb? So it doesn't show any carriers on this specific pedigree. But I want you guys to try and point out, based on the people who have inherited hitchhiker's thumb, who do you think are the carriers of it? And then finally, this specific person, 4-3, do you think they could be a carrier of this trait? So kind of a mix of super basic pedigree questions and some questions to make you think a little bit about how these traits are passed down between the generations. All right. So any questions about pedigrees or sex-linked traits or the homework assignment for today?
No, Mr. Michael. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Seema. Alrighty, guys. Well, if you do ever have any questions, please remember you can always reach out